Yeah. Okay, let's talk about NATO for a minute. Many years ago, the United States and others promised that NATO would not expand 1 inch closer to Russia. They've since added multiple countries. Then they start talking about adding Ukraine. Putin's, ears perk up. He's under the belief that this won't happen with the Minsk Accords and different things like that. Now this battle's going on. Now we're looking at Sweden and Finland, which are higher up, up north by like St. Petersburg, Russia. They're talking very seriously about joining NATO. Is there going to be a military operation against them, or do they not see them as a threat like they did Ukraine?
No, that's a good question. Ukraine is essential to the existential survival of Russia. There's unique geographical areas, there's religious, there's cultural, there's ethnic, there's a whole host of things that ties Ukraine to Russia that Finland doesn't have. The Russians, because of Finnish and Swedish neutrality, Russia has not committed resources, military resources into that area because there was no need to. Now that Finland and Sweden are joining, what Russia has said is, if you're a member of NATO, you're a member of NATO. Article 5 protections apply. So Russia's not going to attack a member of NATO, thereby engendering a conflict with NATO. But they said that the free ride is over. To give you an example, Sweden, with a standing army of 18 to 20,000, is now have to deal with the fact that the Russians are building a 70,000 strong army corps in Karelia that will not only shield St. Petersburg from any incursion out of Finland, but also puts Helsinki, the capital of Finland, at risk, meaning that if there is a conflict, the Finns are going to lose their capital city because they've got nothing to stop the Russians. So Finland's going to have to now double down, and they're going to have to start building a military with resources they don't have. And Russia has said that if Finland wants to maintain its current level of military activity, fine. But if they start bringing NATO infrastructure into Finland, that changes the strategic picture, and then Russia will have to respond accordingly. That doesn't mean that Russia is going to attack, but it means that Russia has to accrue military capability that can neutralize and defeat whatever NATO brings in. And so we're going to see an escalation of tensions in that area, but it doesn't automatically translate to war. Nobody wants a direct war between NATO and Russia because it could lead to nuclear conflict. But what it means is that we have a new level of instability that didn't need to occur. There's no reason for Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Russia posed no threat to them whatsoever. And if you look at it from a logical standpoint, their national security posture is actually worsened because now they've become attached to an alliance that has said that they are in strategic conflict with Russia, which means they are now in strategic conflict with Russia when they weren't previously, which means they're going to have to put down hundreds of billions of dollars investment into military that otherwise didn't need to be spent. And I don't know about you, but I can imagine better ways to spend $100 billion, like on healthcare, on education, on infrastructure, than pouring into a military that can never be used because a war with Russia would mean nuclear war and we're all going to die anyways.
Okay. So they're maybe unnecessarily joining NATO out of pressure, because if there was no bad blood between the two countries and no need to attack, they can trade. It just seems like, again, NATO, maybe the United States, is pushing to do like a cauldron around Russia, where, now NATO's on multiple borders instead of just a threat from, having Ukraine be bordered up against Russia as a NATO nation.
No, there's no look. This extends NATO's frontage with Russia by 810 miles. So if you take a look at the map, I mean that's a long border between Finland and Russia. I think we have to understand too the history between Finland and Russia, and Sweden. Finland, 200 years ago was Swedish and then Russian, then Swedish and Russia. And at the time of the First World War, Finland was a largely autonomous part of the Russian Empire. But when the Russian Revolution took place, Finland broke away, and Russia respected that. Russia said, okay, we're not going to demand that you remain part of us. And so Finland developed um, sort of as when I say pro-white, they were sympathetic to the former monarchy. They're not pro-Bolshevik, they're not pro-communist, which allowed them to align themselves with Germany, etc. In 1939, there was a winter war fought because the Russians felt threatened by the Finnish presence near Leningrad. In the Winter War, Finns fought hard, but eventually the Russians compelled them to surrender in early 1940. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Finland joined and participated in the siege of Leningrad, where 1 million Soviet citizens died. And they fought alongside Nazi Germany. When the war ended, Finland surrendered, and Russia, rather than occupying them and absorbing them, as they should have probably done, they said, we'll let you be independent, but you need to be neutral forever. We can no longer allow you to become a base for Nazi Germany coming in and threatening Leningrad. What has Finland done? From the perspective of Russia, NATO is a threat. NATO is engaged in what NATO describes as a strategic conflict against Russia designed to achieve strategic defeat of Russia. So Finland has now joined this alliance. And with its history of joining alliances and allowing their territory to be used as a jumping off point to invade Russia, the Russians have every right to be concerned about this. And so I think, a lot of people look at this and say, well, that's just Putin being Putin, the Russians being bullies and all this stuff. Given Finland's track record, this was really one of the dumbest things they've ever done.
Okay. Speaking of dumb things that countries have done, the U.S. Senate voted to finally, I don't know the exact language, but basically finally withdraw Congress's permission for money to be used towards the Iraqi war. I know that you had some direct involvement in the weapons of mass destruction lie and Colin Powell. Could you maybe give just a brief history of your role in that? And then what are your thoughts on Congress voting on this new measure?
Sure. I mean, my relationship with the Iraq conflict actually goes back to the early years of my involvement in the Marine Corps. I was assigned to a Marine Corps brigade, the 7th Marine Amphibious Brigade. That was the Marine Corps component of the Rapid Deployment Force, part of the Carter Doctrine of being prepared to intervene in the Middle East in case of a Soviet incursion or some instability to protect our oil. And so I was an analyst of the Iran-Iraq war. I spent a lot of time studying both the Iranian military and the Iraqi military. I bring that up because in August 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, I was taken out of my professional level school and assigned to the Commandant of the Marine Corps as part of a operational planning cell to plan military operations against Iraq in the lead up to Desert Storm. I ended up being attached to General Norman Schwarzkopf's headquarters, where I played an active role in hunting Iraqi Scud missiles during the Gulf War. It was that military experience, when combined with my prior experience as a weapons inspector in the Soviet Union, that made my resume attractive to the United Nations Special Commission, which was created in the aftermath of the war, tasked with getting rid of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear, long-range ballistic missiles. So I was brought in to create an intelligence capability for the United Nations, and later that turned into an operational capability to carry out inspection, searching. I did that job for 7 years. And so I was probably better positioned than almost anybody in the world to know the truth about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program and the threat it posed to the United States. And long story short, when the Bush administration was making its case for war in 2002, I was a vocal opponent, saying that while we could not certify that Iraq was fully disarmed, whatever Iraq could have retained does not constitute a threat worthy of war, and that the Bush administration must be able to back up its claims of Iraqi capability with facts. And void of those facts, I have to rely upon the fact set I know, which says there is no threat. This is why when Colin Powell gave his presentation before the Security Council on February 5th of 2003, I immediately said that everything he said was a lie, and it turns out that everything he said was a lie because it was just made up. And we went to war on a lie. Congress gave permission to invade Iraq, essentially, based upon a non-existent threat posed by weapons of mass destruction. Then they redefined the conflict as not about eliminating WMD or eliminating Saddam because he was gone, but about promoting democracy. And then we extended this conflict in 2014 as an anti-ISIS conflict when ISIS sprang out of the Syrian desert, et cetera. And there's been a lot of people who have said that, the current military posture of the United States in Iraq and in Syria lacks constitutional authority, that the existing war powers authorities were insufficient to justify legally the force. I will have to be honest, I have to read the new congressional legislation more clearly to find out what it said. But what I think is probably happening is that they are divorcing the present reality from the past, that they're no longer trying to stretch the imagination of Americans into believing that the authority granted in 2003 is somehow applicable in 2023, that in the 20 years the situation has changed, and therefore they have updated the legislation to provide legitimacy to the current reality, but it's no longer linked to Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction.
Okay. I had wondered if maybe that's what it was, where it's like, listen, this tyrant of a leader is gone. All of the people involved are gone. Like, why are we still there? Why are we still spending money? Why do we have that permission? What was interesting was to watch some of these congressional testimonies last week where members of Congress were drilling Lloyd Austin and basically saying that he was trying to delay the information about these attacks in Syria so that they wouldn't repeal the Iraqi permission and the money and the troops there. And so it got kind of heated back and forth because it seems the military or the military industrial complex, they're not ready to pull out or stop spending or fighting, even though members of Congress are.
No, you're 100% correct. Look, I'm not going to pick on Lloyd Austin. I don't know him. I have no personal grudge against Lloyd Austin. But I will say this. The American people have not been well served by the senior military for a long time now. If we take a look at the Afghan conflict and we go back and review the testimony of people like General Petraeus and people who followed on, we realized that they were deceptive the entire time, that their testimony was not meant to be honest. It was meant to achieve a political result designed to sustain a conflict that was unsustainable. That we knew that we had lost the Iraq conflict more than 10 years prior to actually finally admitting that we had lost it. But in the meantime, hundreds of Americans and tens of thousands of Afghans lost their lives. It's the same thing with Iraq. Lie after lie, distortion after distortion. And unfortunately, General Austin comes from that era. He's somebody who, when he had 4 stars on his shoulders, lied before Congress. And therefore, a tiger doesn't change its stripes. He's still there today. And I believe it's just in his DNA to deceive Congress. The military forgets who they work for sometimes. They don't work. While the President of the United States is the commander in chief, the military is responsible, constitutionally to tell the truth to Congress. They don't have permission to lie, and yet the military often lies, often conceals the truth, and they lie through omission, not necessarily going out and committing a lie, but omitting data that would make their testimony less than truthful. And I think General Austin is guilty of that.
Okay. We're running out of time. I appreciate you coming on. The next time we get on, I want to talk about a potential war between the United States and China, their Navy, our Navy. I've seen some interviews where you've shared some really good information. I don't want to get into that now. But do you think, I know that Putin wants to build this army of 300,000 to 700,000 trained people. They've been working on this for months. Do you see him achieving that? And if so, do they continue to push all the way west into Ukraine? Or does this thing run out of ammunition and become a totally different war in the next couple months?
No, I think the Russians have succeeded in building up the army to the capacity necessary to achieve their stated objectives. The timing of this is interesting. The battle for Bakhmut that we see raging right now began last May, almost a year ago. This isn't a battle that just started. The Russians have been shaping this battle and grinding the Ukrainians down for nearly a year now. They've they've had some setbacks in Kharkov in the north and Kherson in the south, but they've stabilized the front. They're pushing across the front right now. Russia is advancing 100, 200, 300, sometimes 500 meters a day. So they're pushing the Ukrainians back. There's a lot of talk right now about a Ukrainian counteroffensive. You hear Zelensky talk about it, you hear others talk about it. And I think this is important because the most optimistic figures show that the Ukrainians possibly have accumulated a force of up to 80,000 men to carry out this. It's not enough. The Russians have 300 to 700,000 men deployed in depth. But the Russian offensive is probably going to wait until the Ukrainians execute this counteroffensive, get destroyed. Now they have no reserves. Now the Russians will be able to push forward with nothing to stop them. If the Russians were starting an offensive today, Ukraine has an 80,000 man reserve that can be used to blunt that, make the Russian operations more difficult. So I think the Russians are playing the patient mode. Either Ukraine commits this 80,000 man force to a counteroffensive, which everybody says must occur in order for Zelensky to, save face, and then they'll be destroyed because you can't beat the Russians. Not with those numbers, not with that force, the differences in force. And then the Russians will launch the attack. Or if the Ukrainians opt not to launch the offensive, which would be the smart thing to do, then Russia will just continue this war of attrition, grinding them down until that 80,000 joins everybody else in the ground, dead or surrendered.
Okay. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for coming on. I know that you study this every day. You're getting intel from different resources. So thank you for coming on and sharing. If people want to learn more, is scottritterextra.com the best way for them to keep up on what you're learning and sharing?
Absolutely. Every article I write goes on there. Every podcast I do, I put on there. And so that's probably the one-stop shop.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this interview, please give this video a like and hit the subscribe button. Also check down below for Scott's website, my newsletter, and also this month's giveaway. Thank you again, Scott, for being on our show.
Thanks for having me.